Hey. Just let me arrange myself, sorry. Good morning, everyone. If we haven't met yet, my name is TJ. I've been really glad to have enjoyed fellowshipping with you all for the past few years here at Christ Life, and it's a joy to be able to bring message from Mark to you this morning, Mark 8:22 to the end of the chapter. Just to kick us off, I'd like to ask you a question. Have you ever learnt something about someone, just kind of completely changed the way, or even just confirmed the way that you thought about them? A lot of people are often surprised to find out that Laura was the one, my wife was the one that was born and raised in Australia, Western Sydney, and I'm the one that was born and raised overseas and then imported here. But for me, the person that I think of most for something like this is my grandmother. I would have loved for Laura to have met her. She was a real pocket rocket, a loose cannon of a woman, a pleasure to be around. I always knew her as a very enjoyable and loving person. But given that she grew up in conservative Christian circles her whole life, I knew that she had a real deep sense of modesty about her. And that was until I learned about the time when she was about 55 years old, she decided to try out belly dancing classes with my auntie. That's pretty wild in itself, but keep in mind, at this point she was about 5'2" and all of 95 to 100 kilos. Kind of adds to the shock of the moment. If you're wondering what it looked like, I found a photo. No, I didn't do that. No, it's all right. But we're all awake now, that's good. Now, the fact that my grandmother would do that kind of left me now, whenever I think of her, I'm a little bit confused as to the kind of woman that she was. And in our story in Mark today, that's kind of the sense of what we have. Jesus reveals something about himself, and we have some confusion. Granted, there's no belly dancing in Mark, but what we do see is a deep sense of honest confusion and even frustration and anger from Jesus' own followers as to what he says about himself. Our author Mark, he's been carried along by God's Spirit to recount to us the critical life events of Jesus, and it's all in an effort to prove the fact of who Jesus is and how we should respond to him. And in this stage in Mark, it kind of marks the turning point in the book. Between chapters 8 and 10, it's where we have the 3 times in Mark's gospel where Jesus says that he's going to die. And in each of these times, Mark frames things around Jesus to really cement down in our minds who he is and how we should respond to him. Now, as he does that as well, he's asking us the story of who we are, asking us the question of who we are and who we think Jesus is. This is an interesting turn of events because in Mark, up until now, we've had a lot of people asking the question, who is Jesus? A lot of people have been asking, who is this man Jesus? He teaches with such authority. We see that in Mark chapter 1, verse 28. Who is this Jesus who commands demons and they obey him? We see that in Mark 1:28 as well. And we also think, who is this Jesus? He can even forgive sins. Mark chapter 2, verse 7. Who is Jesus? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Mark 4:41. And who is this Jesus who preaches such mighty words and does mighty works? Mark chapter 6, verse 2. It's an ongoing question. Who is Jesus? But now if you look in verse 27, Jesus asks the question himself. He asks his disciples, who do people say I am? And it seems that most of the people in the story of Mark so far have kind of missed the point on who Jesus is. They think Jesus is the prophet Elijah, or he's the resurrected John the Baptist, or some other great prophet, which, although it's quite incredible to think that of someone, it's a real step down from what Jesus has been saying about himself. But what about his disciples? What about the men who have been following Jesus for the better part of 3 years? Well, in verse 30, we see the response of Peter. He kind of acts as a spokesperson for the disciples, and he pipes up and he says, "You are the Christ." And it's an incredible moment because he gets it right. It's incredible news. The gravity of this situation is huge. The title Christ, or as it's translated Messiah, it simply means anointed one, but in the context of the Bible story, it means God's anointed one. Someone who has been set apart by God for a specific task. And it was a title only reserved for Israel's kings, Israel's priests, Israel's prophets, the political and religious leaders of Israel. But even bigger than that, the Old Testament, the history of the world, the history of Israel leading up to Jesus, has been building this expectation that God is going to raise up one ultimate, final Messiah. And here in Mark, we see that Jesus is that Messiah. He's this Messiah who would bring about a global and an eternal kingdom. A king who would rule this global and eternal kingdom, a king who would be universally praised and honored and served and worshipped. He would be the king who would bring in a new world order of peace and prosperity that lasted forever, a new world order under the rule and authority of God. It's a big unveiling moment in the story of Mark. It's all been building to this. This is the turning point. And it's so interesting that Jesus, instead of doing and saying something majestic in the moment, like, let's go, do something great, they'll take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. Instead, he tells them not to tell anyone. Jesus has just been unveiled as the Messiah, the Christ, God's eternal global king, and he tells them, don't tell anyone. And then he tells them he must die. Not only is he going to die, and we see this in verse 31, not only is he going to die, but he's going to be rejected. And not just rejected by anybody, but rejected by the chief priests and the scribes, essentially the people who represented the moral and religious authorities of Jesus' day. So in a nutshell, Jesus, he says he's the global eternal king, God's Messiah, God's chosen one, to be rejected and killed by the influential and powerful of the world, but who is then going to rise again from the dead. Cue the confusion. It's like Peter has just bitten into a chocolate chip cookie and realized it's sultanas. He's more confused. For him, it's hearing his hopes and dreams for a future for Israel, a future of this eternal kingdom. They've just been dashed. And in verse 32, we see his response. He's angry enough to rebuke the man that he has just identified as the Messiah. Angry enough to rebuke God's chosen king. Now, why would he do that? Why does Peter rebuke the man that he sees as the Messiah? Well, interestingly, Mark has kind of given us a little illustration to help us understand what's happening. And he's done it with the healing of the blind man, as we've kind of just seen helpfully in the kids' spot. If you read verses 22 to 26, it's not just Jesus having an off Monday morning and having to have 2 goes at healing someone. We see that it's an illustration of what's happening in the latest story. The blind man condition, he's blind, he can't see anything. Then Jesus partially heals him and he can kind of see but not clearly. And then he can see clearly. It's like the people, the blind condition, it's like the people at the beginning in verse 27. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" But they can only see him as a prophet. It's like they're blind to who he is. They really don't see who he is, that he's the Son of God. But then we see Peter. He sees Jesus as the Christ, but he doesn't see him clearly. It's like the blind man who can see that he's looking at men, but they look like trees walking around. Peter sees that Jesus is the Messiah, but it's still not clear what that means. And it's at this point in the story where Mark's kind of encouraging us to pause and think, do we see Jesus clearly? Or does he look like a tree walking around? Is he just a good teacher to us, someone who gives decent moral guidance? Is he the person who died for our sins, and so we appreciate that, but we feel that he has no input or impact on our everyday life? Is he our faith genie, someone who has made a way for us to have long-lasting success and prosperity, provided we have enough faith to receive it? Is he a terrifying dictator, the one who holds ultimate power, ready to punish at any mishap? Jesus is making it clear to his disciples that he is the King of the world, the one who rules over everything, but the one who uses this power and authority to serve and save the weak, even his own enemies. He is both the Savior we need and the King we must worship. But it's such a struggle to see him clearly. And what is it that prevents us from seeing Jesus clearly? What is it that prevents Peter from seeing Jesus clearly? Well, in verse 33, Jesus kind of spells it out. And we see it's the difference between the mind of God and the mind of man. Jesus tells Peter, he rebukes Peter, and he says that he doesn't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. It's fair enough, but what's interesting is what he said just before that. What did Jesus just call Peter in his rebuke? Satan. Oof. I've been sledged before, but this is a bit brutal. Why does he say that Peter why does he call Peter Satan, and then say that he has in mind not the concerns of God, but human concerns? Why does he say he has in mind human concerns as compared to Satan's concerns? What is Jesus saying about human concerns? Well, I don't think I'm overstating it, but it seems as though Jesus sees Satan's concerns and human concerns as one and the same thing. If we were to think about it, it kind of makes sense. You know, Satan, he is against God and God's plans, and here we see Peter is setting himself against God and God's plans by trying to stop Jesus from going to the cross. And surely it could just come down to Peter's basic concern for his friend. I mean, this is his closest friend that he's had for the past few years. Of course he'd be concerned. But I'd like to suggest that there's another reason. And I think it's quite well founded based on what Mark spells out about Peter and the disciples later on. You don't have to flick to it now, but if you were to look at Mark chapter 9, verses 33 and 34, we see that Peter, along with the other disciples, they're all arguing together over who is the greatest disciple. And after that, and the interesting thing about that is the context of that argument is in verse 31 and 32, Jesus has just explained to them that he's going to die and rise again. If you go to Mark 10, 35 to 44, here we see James and John arrogantly asking Jesus that they want Jesus to do anything that they want, that they ask, and then they ask Jesus for seats of power second only to Jesus. Jesus, you are the king of everything. You can have the total rule and authority, but we just want the next seat under that. We want to have ultimate authority just under you. And interestingly, their request for power and prestige happens right after Jesus has told them for the third and final time in Mark about his death and resurrection. You can kind of see an ugly pattern emerging here. 3 times that Jesus talks about his death and resurrection, 3 times the disciples act with pride and arrogance. While Jesus is concerned with his humble submission to God's plan to use the power and authority to die for the sake of the lost, they are concerned with glory, with their own self-importance, driven by pride. They seem to be following Jesus for what they think they can get out of Jesus. And I think this is what the human condition that Jesus is talking about. Condition that is spelt out all throughout the Bible, from the beginning in Genesis 3, where we see Adam and Eve desiring to be like God rather than trusting and submitting to God and enjoying his creation. In Genesis 11, when we have the Tower of Babel, humanity is desiring to make a name for themselves rather than obeying God. In Isaiah 12, 7-8, we see Satan desiring a throne above God's. Jesus' disciples, following Jesus, exalting themselves, not submitting or understanding Jesus' agenda to become a servant to all and dying to ransom many. In their efforts to follow Jesus, the disciples have ended up making it all about themselves. They're concerned with their own greatness and glory, which is why the idea of Jesus being rejected by the religious elite and influential is aggravating. Peter doesn't want it to be true. Because if this is the Jesus who he is following, then this is who Peter will be called to be. If our leader is someone who humbles himself and lays down his life for the sake of others, what will be required of us? When we see the road that Jesus took and hear his call to follow him, often our response is that we don't like it. Because at the end of the day, we have human concerns, not God's concerns. We desire to exalt ourselves. It's sin. That's the shorthand description, I believe. Humans' concerns, Satan's concerns, sin. They don't always look the same, but rejecting God's plans for something that you feel benefits you more all comes from the same place. A desire to exalt and fulfill our own plans above God's. And it seems to Jesus then that to be a Satanist, you don't need to wear a black robe and carry an upside-down cross and read from a satanic Bible. No, we just need to follow our own human concerns. And we all do it. It's because of our pride we all stand the risk of missing the point of who Jesus is. We all stand the risk of exalting ourselves above him. Whenever we relegate Jesus to simply being an extra in our lives, he's all well and good as long as he doesn't get in the way of my career, my family, my leisure. When even our Christianity becomes just checking boxes, when really our lives are driven by our own ambitions of financial success or financial security. And Jesus is just relegated to the outskirts of our private lives. We're content to follow him, provided he doesn't ask us to sacrifice anything that we really care about. This is the issue Jesus is addressing. This is what Mark wants us to see about who Jesus is. I'd like to just pause a minute. This all feels very hard. Jesus calling one of his disciples Satan can almost make him feel like a prickly cactus that we're being told to hug. But I'd just like to take a moment to draw attention to verse 33. What is it that caused Jesus to rebuke Peter? What is it that caused Jesus to act how he did? Well, it's when he turns and he sees his disciples. This isn't Jesus just reacting angrily to Peter. This is Jesus lovingly yet firmly making a point about who he is, about what we're like, because this is Jesus opening the eyes of the blind man so that he can see clearly. This is Jesus lovingly showing us who he is and how we should respond to him. Because as we see in the later verses here from verses 34 to 38, that understanding who Jesus is and following him, it matters because it concerns our life. Verse 34 says, Jesus calls the crowd to him with his disciples, and he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and the holy angels." In all honesty, I kind of struggled a little bit thinking about how I would preach this next point. Jesus showing us who he is and then calling us to respond. But before we think about how we should respond to who Jesus is, I think that given the context of this passage, that this is all about revealing who Jesus is to us, it's important for us to think about how do Jesus' words in verses 34 to 38 reveal to us more about who he is. And I think it's quite straightforward. It all sounds very interesting and weird as far as Christianity is concerned, that to be a Christian we have to lose our lives to save it. We have to deny ourselves to have life, be unashamed of what others consider shameful. But again, this is all about Jesus revealing himself. What Jesus is saying here, he's not just telling us what we need to do, he's actually foreshadowing what he's going to do. Jesus hasn't told anyone yet that he's going to die on a cross. And so when he calls his disciples to follow him to the cross, he's letting us know that he plans to go himself. Anything that Jesus calls us to do is something that he has already done for us. To deny ourselves, Jesus denied himself. He denied himself by being the Son of God, the ruler of everything. Everything was made through Jesus and for Jesus, yet he denied his eternal heavenly glory to come down as a man and serve those around him. He denied his desires for self-preservation in the Garden of Gethsemane by praying, "Lord, not my will, but yours be done," and going to the cross for those who hated him instead. When Jesus calls us to take up our cross, it's not the same cross that he took up. When Jesus took up a cross, he's actually taking up our cross of judgment from God. When we take up our cross, we are taking up a cross of allegiance to Jesus. To follow Jesus is to simply follow in the things that he did for us, because as he says, that is where we find life. So denying ourselves, this isn't simply a denial of things that we love and enjoy. This isn't just a case of every time that Lent comes around, we give up chocolate for 40 days. This isn't even just Jesus saying you can't have fun. Denying yourself, remember in the context of Mark 8:22 to 38, is all about denying the pride that we have to exalt ourselves above God, exalt ourselves above Jesus. The denial of self is to see ourselves through Jesus' eyes, sinners needing salvation, and people made by God for his glory. Denying ourselves means putting ourselves aside for the humble submission of following Jesus. Often when we read things like this in our discomfort, we can try to soften the blow of the instruction. So when we see something like taking up our cross, We feel as though we can change that by just saying, oh, this is Jesus telling us to carry our burdens, like putting up with that difficult family member over Christmas. But when Jesus is talking about the cross here, he's talking about everything that went into the public execution and humiliation of criminals in his day. The cross was not a subject you brought up is not a subject that you brought up in polite conversation. But interestingly as well, the cross, it's not something we often focus a little too much on the pain and the torture and the torment of the cross. When you look at the Gospels, the thing that is focused on often is the shame, the humiliation, the mocking. The cross was a shameful death. It was a humiliating death. When you read the Gospels and you see Jesus on the cross, the thing that is most often emphasized is those who are rejecting him, those who are belittling him, those who are mocking him. When Jesus tells us to carry our cross, it's not disregarding that we might suffer physically, but it's telling us that to follow Jesus is going to lead to shame and rejection in a world that rejects Jesus. Just as Jesus was rejected by the moral and religious elite and influential of his day, those who follow Jesus can expect to be relegated to the shadows of moral shame, of rejection by the moral elite and influential of their day. When Jesus calls us to follow him, he's telling us to be willing to be seen as less than in our day, just as he was seen as less than by those around him. So why on earth would we follow Jesus? If it means that we have to deny ourselves, that we have to surrender our plans and aspirations to him, if it means that we have to endure humiliation and public shame, even violence and torture for the sake of him and his message. Well, it all comes down again as to who is Jesus. From the lips of Jesus, he is the Son of Man who came to die for the sake of his enemies. Why would we follow Jesus? Verse 36, because there is a price on our soul that we can't pay. Verse 37, there is nothing we can give in return for our soul. Why should we follow Jesus? Because he is the one that paid the price for our soul. Why should we follow Jesus? Because in following Jesus there is life. But why should we also follow Jesus? Because of the warning of judgment. Jesus laid the path of rejection, of shame and humiliation, but then rose from the grave and will come back as the Son of Man to judge the world. Why follow Jesus? Because he is sitting enthroned in power above everything, and he will return. And he gives the warning that of those who are ashamed of him when he comes, he will be ashamed of them. Jesus is the complete opposite of our sinful and adulterous generation. Yet he dies for our sinful and adulterous generation. That's you and me. He is the creator, the sustainer, and the ruler of the world, and we as sinners are set against him, yet he dies for us. So why follow him? Because he denied himself. He took up our cross and he bore our judgment when he died for us. And even though we were sinful and adulterous and hostile to him, outside of him we stand in judgment. In him we can boldly stand in God's presence as dearly loved children of God. There is no one more spectacular who would love us this much. It's like Mark is crying out to us, what in your life is so worthwhile that you would give up Jesus for it? Jesus is God's King who dies in the place of God's enemies. The risen King who, after humbling himself to the point of death, was raised to life, who is highly exalted above everything, so that when he returns, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. This is the Jesus that Mark is telling us in his passage. He comes to judge the sinful and adulterous generation who, after hearing his gospel message, did not turn back to him in repentance. But he comes to take those who do, by faith, hold their allegiance to him. So what does it look like to follow this Jesus? I'd like to just wrap up our time briefly by giving some practical suggestions of what it looks like to follow the suffering King. As we see, the pattern of Jesus is to give up power, to give up glory, to humble ourselves, to serve others, waiting in faith for God to exalt us. The common saying is that there is the cross before the crown, the humiliation before the exaltation. And even though this passage, for me at least, gives me the sense that we should all go to a country that is hostile towards Christianity and run through the airport throwing out Bibles until we're all martyred, following Jesus, it can lead to that. I'm not saying don't do that, maybe, but it is more than that. Following Jesus is a life of self-denial, of our pride in humble submission to him. It's first and foremost a matter of the heart. Like Peter, like the disciples, we need God to open our eyes and change our hearts to see and accept and cherish the beauty of Jesus. So, to do that, we need to pray. You need to pray, I need to pray, we need to pray to ask God to help us see the beauty of Jesus and accept it in faith. We need to read our Bibles to see the beauty of Jesus in it revealed to us. We need to meditate on what God is saying to us through his written word and pray that by his Spirit it would be applied to our hearts. And then we need to, as Jesus says, respond by denying ourselves, taking up our crosses and following Jesus. The difference between legalism and the gospel is that a changed life happens not in order to earn God's favor, but as a result of receiving God's favor through faith in Jesus. Mark 8 isn't an example of how we become God's children. It's a instruction on how we live as God's children with our allegiance to Jesus. So, let's humble ourselves. Let us not follow the path of the world that seeks to exalt ourselves, exalt our jobs, our careers, or our families over God. Let's consider something as outrageous as downsizing our lifestyle, not working overtime for the sake of getting more money, so that we can dedicate more time to loving those around us with God's gospel. Making time to make it to things like small groups where you can encourage the believers around you with their faith in Jesus. Making time so that you can maybe read the Bible with someone who doesn't yet know Jesus. Downsizing our lifestyle so that we don't need to spend as much money to maintain the pleasures that we have around us, but so that we can give money financially to ministries that help push the gospel out to others. Brothers and sisters, Mark is asking us, do we see who Jesus is? Do we see what he means for you and I? Let's go and let others into this wonderful insight of who Jesus is. Let us, as Hebrews says, go outside to Jesus, outside the camp, outside the normal, acceptable things of our society and culture, and let us bear the shame and reproach that he did. Let's be shameful to a sinful and adulterous world as we lovingly cling to Jesus. And then let's go to that sinful and adulterous world through sacrificial service and proclamation of the gospel. Let me pray. Dear Lord, thank you for your goodness to us in Jesus. That though he was the Son of God, he did not count equality with God something that he should hold on to, but gave it all up. And taking the form of a servant, he became humble in obedience to you, even to the point of death on a cross, Lord. But we thank you that he now sits exalted over everything and calls us to follow him. in the same life that he lived, in humble service and submission to you for the love and service of others. Help us to see the beauty of Jesus more, so that we would be more and more motivated to live lives for him, to tell others about him, that we may all rejoice and celebrate when he returns. In his name we pray. Amen.